It was supposed to be a routine red-eye flight from Chicago to Los Angeles, quiet, uneventful, just another leg for the seasoned crew of Skyline Airways Flight 237. The mood in first class was calm, filled with the soft hum of conversation, the rustle of newspapers, and the occasional clink of glasses. That calm shattered when flight attendant Lindsay Monroe raised her voice and pointed directly at a passenger seated near the window in seat 3A. Look, she has drugs in her bag, she announced, holding up a small vacuum-sealed package like evidence at a trial. This passenger brought illegal substances onto this aircraft. She declared, her voice firm and full of manufactured outrage. Every head in the cabin turned, and within seconds phones were out, recording what would soon become one of the most viral flight incidents of the year. The woman being accused, Danielle Reed, sat frozen in disbelief as whispers swirled around her, dressed in a sleek black blazer and slacks with braided hair tied into a low bun. She had commanded quiet attention when she first boarded the aircraft. But now that quiet dignity was being dragged through the mud in front of dozens of strangers. The humiliation was not subtle, it was public and deliberate. As Lindsay continued her performance, describing how she had spotted the suspicious item during routine checks, passengers captured every second of Danielle's silent, stunned reaction. She made no scene, offered no protest. She simply looked Lindsay in the eye and held her composure. Though it was clear the accusation cut deep. Airport security was already waiting when the flight made an unscheduled stop in Denver. As Danielle stood to be escorted off the plane, Lindsay watched with a satisfied smirk from the galley arms, folded like a self-declared hero. But just as Danielle passed her, she leaned in ever so slightly and spoke in a voice only Lindsay could hear. "You have no idea what you've just done." The words were soft, but the tone was razor-sharp. Lindsay's confidence faltered for the first time. A chill raced down her spine, but she quickly brushed it off. To her, this was just another win, another step toward the recognition she thought she deserved. What Lindsay didn't realize was that Danielle Reed wasn't just any passenger. She wasn't a celebrity or influencer, nor was she a corporate executive flying in luxury. Danielle was a federal agent, one of the CIA's highest-ranking operatives assigned to a covert mission to investigate a drug smuggling operation suspected of using commercial airliners. Everything about her presence on that flight had been carefully calculated, from her appearance to her seat assignment. She had flown under the radar exactly as intended. No one, not even the pilot, knew who she really was, and Lindsay Monroe had just made the grave mistake of accusing her publicly on camera. As Danielle was led down the aisle past a sea of judging eyes and raised phones, the scene painted a picture of scandal. The whispers were loud, unbelievable. Did you see what she was hiding in first class, no less? None of them could have known that they were watching not a criminal being caught, but a top intelligence agent walking straight into the most dangerous part of her operation. To the public eye, Danielle was the suspect, but in reality she had just identified her main target, Lindsay Monroe. The mission, which had begun as a quiet observation, had now become something much bigger, much darker. And while Lindsay soaked in her moment of manufactured glory, believing she had done her duty, the true operation had only just begun. Her actions had triggered a chain of events that would not only expose her own criminal involvement, but also bring down a multi-layer drug trafficking network within the aviation industry. What she had intended as a career-making moment would instead become the mistake that unraveled everything. And Danielle, calm and composed, even in the face of injustice, was ready to make sure of it. Danielle Reed didn't look like the kind of person who had once crawled through underground tunnels in Moldova to dismantle a black market arms deal. Nor did she look like someone who had gone head-to-head with insurgents in remote villages of the Caucasus. On that plane, in tailored civilian clothes and with a quiet, composed demeanor, she was just another passenger sipping sparkling water. But beneath the calm exterior and graceful poise was one of the most decorated covert agents the CIA had ever trained. At 39, Danielle had already accomplished what most agents only dreamt of: leading 3 international anti-terrorism operations, dismantling a financial laundering ring in Berlin, and saving the lives of over 1,000 civilians in an unsanctioned counterinsurgency mission that never made it to the press. She wasn't just experienced, she was elite. Born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, Danielle's path had been anything but predictable. The daughter of a school teacher and a postal worker, she had grown up in a neighborhood where ambition was often stifled by circumstance. But even as a teenager, Danielle stood apart, top of her class, fierce in debate, relentless on the track team. She had something that couldn't be taught: drive. That fire eventually led her to Georgetown and then to Langley, where her application to the CIA was initially met with skepticism. A young black woman with no military background, no family history of government service. She was the anomaly in a sea of legacy recruits. But within her first year, Danielle proved she wasn't just a statistic, she was a force. By her third year, she was leading her own operations. By her fifth, she was on the agency's fast track for leadership. Her latest mission, codenamed Flight Risk, had been in planning for over 9 months. Intelligence had uncovered a growing pattern of high-grade narcotics being moved across state lines using commercial flights slipping past TSA and internal checks by exploiting crew member immunity and procedural loopholes. The CIA believed it was more than a few rogue employees. It was a network, and they needed someone who could see the invisible, who could think 2 steps ahead without ever tipping their hand. There was no question who would be assigned. Danielle was briefed personally by CIA Director James Rutledge. Her objective: go undercover as a civilian passenger, identify personnel involved, and gather irrefutable evidence for a federal takedown. The cover was airtight. New identity forged documents, untraceable itinerary. Only one person outside the agency had been told the truth: Matthew Gordon, CEO of Skyline Airways. Gordon wasn't just any airline executive, a former Navy pilot turned corporate leader. He had spent the last decade rebuilding Skyline's reputation after a string of PR disasters and financial mismanagement. When the CIA approached him with suspicions that his company's planes were being used as trafficking routes, he could have denied it or buried the report. Instead, he did something rare in his industry. He cooperated fully. He even insisted on being the sole point of contact between the airline and the agency. "I don't want this leaking," he had told Rutledge. "Give me the truth and I'll clean house." It was Gordon who signed off on Danielle's flight manifest, made sure her name was untraceable, and personally ensured the crew on Flight 237 knew nothing about who she really was. For all they could see, she was just another well-dressed first-class traveler. And that's exactly what Danielle needed to be. Danielle had spent weeks preparing for the mission, not just studying airline procedures and security blind spots, but memorizing every employee profile, every shift, roster, every flagged name. Her mind was a database of facial patterns and behavioral cues. She knew who clocked in late, who had off-the-record conversations with suspicious passengers, and who had unexplained cash deposits in their financials. One name had surfaced again and again in reports from internal whistleblowers: Lindsay Monroe, a flight attendant with a pristine public record, but far too many inconsistencies behind the scenes. Danielle didn't yet have enough proof to act, but she had the instincts, and they were rarely wrong. All she needed was one flight, one slip-up, and her mission could move from observation to action. That's why she boarded Flight 237 without backup, because when Danielle moved, she moved alone. And precisely what made Danielle truly exceptional wasn't just her intelligence, her combat training, or her flawless service record. It was her gift for invisibility. She had an almost preternatural ability to blend in while absorbing everything around her. Where others saw polite exchanges, Danielle saw coded language. Where others noticed smiles, she noted tension behind the eyes. She could watch 2 people pass a sugar packet and identify it as a silent handoff. That was her weapon perception. She didn't need to confront to control the room. She just needed to observe long enough for people to show their true selves. And when Lindsay Monroe called her out publicly, when she held that small package high for all the world to see, Danielle didn't panic. She didn't need to. The trap had already been set. All she had to do now was let Lindsay step right into it. Danielle Reed had been trained to notice everything. Changes in body language, inconsistencies in stories, the tiniest signals of human behavior that hinted at deeper truths. But sometimes the most dangerous signals weren't dramatic at all. Sometimes they were the soft slights, the quiet coldness, the tiny decisions made over and over again by people who thought they were just doing their jobs. From the moment Lindsay Monroe walked down the aisle with her professional smile and glossy uniform, Danielle knew something was off. The flight attendant's demeanor shifted subtly but unmistakably depending on whom she addressed. To the older white couple in 2A and 2B, Lindsay offered warmth and friendly banter. To the white executive in 1C, she practically gushed, laughing at his jokes and calling him sir with practiced charm. But when she arrived at 3A Danielle's seat, the change was stark. No eye contact, no welcome aboard, just a clipped anything to drink. Like she was a problem to be dealt with, not a customer to be served. Danielle kept her expression neutral, her voice calm. "Sparkling water, please," she replied evenly. Lindsay gave a slight nod, then walked away without another word. When she returned, the glass was practically dropped onto Danielle's tray without a glance, but it wasn't just the tone, it was the sequence. On 2 separate occasions, Danielle had pressed the call button discreetly above her seat. Both times, Lindsay walked past her without acknowledgement, even as she stopped for passengers on either side. A few rows up, a white man in 2C had his call button answered. In under 30 seconds, greeted with, "What can I get for you, sir?" Lindsay brought him a scotch with a smile. Danielle, meanwhile, sat for over 10 minutes, her button lit invisible in plain sight. This wasn't a one-off mistake. It was a pattern. It wasn't Danielle's first time encountering this type of behavior. In fact, she'd been trained for it. Subtle bias in service settings was often a key indicator in security profiling. Bias, after all, created patterns. Patterns created blind spots, and blind spots were the perfect hiding places for criminal operations. Danielle had seen it before in international hotels, embassies, even airport checkpoints. But witnessing it in a domestic airline under the pretense of hospitality hit differently. It was more personal. This wasn't a war zone, it was first class. Yet somehow the battlefield felt just as real. And unlike most passengers, Danielle wasn't here just to endure the behavior. She was here to record it. Every missed interaction, every dismissive tone, every inconsistency. She documented it all in real time, using her agency-issued social media app, which looked like an innocuous note-taking tool, but transmitted encrypted logs to a secure CIA cloud server. By the time lunch service began, Danielle had noted 7 different instances of disparate treatment. She watched how Lindsay placed napkins gently in one passenger's lap while tossing them on another's tray, how she offered refills to certain guests without being asked while barely acknowledging others. Danielle noticed how Lindsay's body language tightened around people of color, shoulders squared, voice, clipped eyes, evasive, while remaining relaxed and open with white passengers. It was a symphony of small signals, and Danielle was listening to every note. This wasn't just poor service, it was targeted, and Lindsay didn't even realize she was performing for an audience far more discerning than the average flyer. The CIA hadn't chosen Danielle for her combat skills or her field endurance. They had chosen her because she could see what others refused to see and remain calm while doing it. But there was another layer beneath the observations, one Danielle rarely let herself acknowledge, mid-mission the personal weight. She had spent her entire career navigating spaces where she was the only one, the only black woman in the room, the only voice not assumed to be wrong. And while her training had taught her to stay composed, to stay above it, to channel every injustice into strategic action, she was still human, still someone who remembered what it was like to be followed in stores, to be questioned for walking into her own hotel suite, to be mistaken for the assistant instead of the speaker. This wasn't new, But the fact that it was happening here on a flight where she was risking her life for national security made the insult sting just a little deeper. Lindsay had no idea she wasn't just being watched, she was being studied, and every act of bias she delivered so casually was becoming evidence in something much bigger. As Lindsay breezed down the aisle one last time, skipping Danielle again while joking with a passenger across the row, Danielle glanced down at her phone and tapped out one final note. Subject exhibits recurring selective service behaviors aligned with racial bias. Indicators. Formal escalation recommended pending further corroboration. Then she closed the app, adjusted her seat slightly, and looked out the window at the clouds rolling by. It would be a long flight. But Danielle was patient. She always had been. And by the time this plane landed, she would have everything she needed to take the next step in her investigation. What Lindsay had mistaken for invisibility wasn't weakness. It was strategy. The illusion Lindsay Monroe maintained was polished, almost admirable in its precision. From the outside, she looked like the perfect professional, a flight attendant with a gleaming smile, a pristine uniform, and the confidence of someone who believed they belonged in first class as much as the passengers she served. But behind the designer lipstick, beneath the tailored blouse, and surgically precise persona, Lindsay was crumbling. The image was expensive, more expensive than her salary could ever sustain. Credit card debt was stacking high and fast, late fees, compounding like interest on shame. She had maxed out 5 different cards, skipped payments on a leased car, and was 3 months behind on rent for a condo she couldn't afford. Her financial downfall wasn't visible in her posture or her words, but it was there, eating away at her behind the scenes. Desperation makes people reckless. For Lindsay, it came 6 months earlier in the form of a conversation with a man in first class, well-dressed, well-spoken, and entirely too interested in how flight crews operated. He didn't ask directly. He didn't need to. A few vague questions, a few offhand remarks about opportunities for extra cash, and Lindsay had leaned in. He offered her a deal transport small sealed packages using her access to restricted areas and restrooms where another passenger would later retrieve them. No risk, just routine, he had promised. You're not even the one handing it off. The money substantial enough to pay off 1 credit card per drop. It was just once, she told herself, then just twice. Then it became part of her routine, no different than the beverage cart or safety checks, but this flight felt different. She was on edge. In the cramped airport bathroom before boarding, Flight 237, Lindsay stood in front of the mirror, hands trembling as she opened her makeup bag. Hidden under a layer of powder and concealer was a vacuum-sealed packet of high-grade narcotics, small enough to pass unnoticed, potent enough to fetch thousands on the street. She checked the zipper 3 times, her reflection staring back like an accusation. 1 more drop, she whispered to herself. Just 1 more. Then I'm done. But she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. The man she worked with, she never learned his name, had grown more aggressive lately, texting her late at night, reminding her of what she owed. You back out. Now I make a call. Easy as that. Lindsay didn't know what kind of call he meant. She didn't ask. She didn't want to. As she boarded the plane and greeted passengers with her usual rehearsed warmth, Danielle Reed watched her with the eyes of someone who was trained to see behind masks. Something about Lindsay's movements felt unnatural, too calculated, too restrained. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and her hands lingered on her carry-on a little too long after she stashed it. Danielle took mental notes, micro-anxieties that most would miss. During boarding, Lindsay repeatedly glanced toward the first-class bathroom and subtly adjusted her apron pocket as if double-checking something was still in place. Her nervousness became more obvious during meal service, hands, slightly shaky speech. Hurried, Danielle noted how Lindsay kept making eye contact with another crew member, Ethan Brooks, a man who seemed to shift uncomfortably every time Danielle passed. There was a rhythm between them, an unspoken dialogue stitched together through glances and silent nods. Midway through the flight, Danielle noticed the pattern intensify. Lindsay would disappear into the galley phone in hand, whispering behind the curtain to Ethan. On one occasion, she left her crew bag in the bathroom for 2 minutes, then returned and moved it again. Danielle's trained instincts knew what to look for: the timeline of a drop package concealed delivery made in a semi-private space, retrieval scheduled soon after by a passenger in on the scheme. And sure enough, not 10 minutes later, a man in an expensive blazer visited the same restroom. When he returned to his seat, Danielle observed a bulge in his jacket pocket that hadn't been there before. No words were exchanged between him and Lindsay, but the exchange had already happened. The operation was underway, and Lindsay had just delivered the goods without saying a word. From her seat, Danielle continued to document everything, each time-stamped note encrypted and uploaded instantly to Langley servers through her CIA-issued app. She had more than enough behavioral data to elevate her suspicions, but still needed the hard evidence the moment Lindsay's hands confirmed what her eyes already knew. And while Danielle remained still, sipping sparkling water and reading from her tablet like any other traveler, Lindsay began to unravel. The weight of the package in her pocket, the paranoia of being caught, and the pressure from her supplier began to show in the tightening of her jaw and the anxious glances over her shoulder. She was trying to stay composed, but Danielle had seen this before. People like Lindsay didn't crack with sirens. They cracked under silence, and silently, piece by piece, the mask Lindsay wore was slipping. The tension inside Lindsay Monroe had been rising with every passing minute. Each glance from Danielle Reed felt sharper, more intentional, like X-rays cutting through the fragile veneer of Lindsay's carefully curated performance. She didn't know who Danielle really was, but she knew something was off. The woman didn't blink when treated coldly, she didn't flinch when ignored, and worst of all, she didn't stop watching Danielle's quiet presence. Her calm eyes, tracking everything, had started to feel less like a passenger's casual observation and more like surveillance. Lindsay's instincts, corrupted by guilt and paranoia, interpreted Danielle's silence as threat. She needed to act before that woman did something. She needed to be the one in control of the narrative. And so the plan began to form, not out of strategy, but out of fear. Not to move drugs this time, but to remove a problem. Lindsay waited for her moment. She watched closely until Danielle stood up and made her way toward the lavatory at the front of the cabin. Timing was everything. There were only a few seconds between a passenger leaving their seat and another crew member entering the aisle. Lindsay quickly reached into the hidden compartment of her apron where she kept a small secondary package. Her own bonus cut meant for private sale later that week. Instead of hiding it, she clutched it tightly, heart-pounding, and slipped down the aisle with practiced ease. Passengers around her were dozing, absorbed in movies or distracted by food trays. When she reached seat 3A, she leaned slightly over Danielle's empty seat under the guise of adjusting the blanket and pillow items she had previously refused to provide. With a single sleight of hand, Lindsay tucked the vacuum-sealed packet into Danielle's carry-on, which was zipped but not locked. It took less than 5 seconds. She straightened up, smoothed her apron, and took a deep breath. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She glanced around. No one seemed to notice. It looked like just another act of service. Her mask back on, she returned to the galley lips curling into a faint artificial smile. This was the insurance policy she told herself she'd never use. But Lindsay was no longer interested in promises, she was in survival mode now. With the trap set, all she needed was the right time to spring it. What Lindsay didn't know, what no one knew, was that every second of her act of service had been captured in crystal clarity. Hidden in the modest brooch pinned to Danielle's collar was a micro-camera developed by the CIA's Advanced Tech Division, smaller than a thumbnail, capable of 4K video audio capture and facial recognition tagging in real time. It streamed directly to a secure CIA archive. The footage was undeniable. The angle perfect. Lindsay's movements, the sleight of hand, the deliberate placement of the package. It was all there. Danielle may not have seen it in the moment, but the camera had. And that meant so had Langley, still unaware that she had walked into a surveillance trap. Lindsay moved on to phase 2 of her plan. She picked up the cabin phone and contacted the captain discreetly, keeping her tone steady. "Captain, I'm concerned about a passenger in seat 3A, she said. She's been acting oddly very evasive. I just noticed something suspicious in her bag. During service, possibly prescription drugs or contraband. It was a carefully worded lie crafted to sound like due diligence. The captain, trained to follow procedure, instructed her to inform the onboard air marshal moments later. Lindsay walked down the aisle with a fellow attendant and a man in civilian clothes, the plainclothes officer assigned to this flight. Standing next to Danielle's seat, Lindsay's voice turned theatrical, loud enough for everyone in first class to hear. Ma'am, I'm going to need to inspect your carry-on immediately. We've received a report of possible illegal substances. Danielle looked up slowly from her tablet. Her face remained unreadable, but her mind was already racing. She didn't object. She didn't resist. Instead, she simply said, "May I ask what this is about?" Lindsay, seizing the moment like a stage actress playing to an invisible camera, responded with faux concern. "Just a routine check, ma'am. You were acting suspicious." The word hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Then she reached for Danielle's bag and pulled out the planted package, holding it up as though it had been caught mid-crime. Gasps erupted around them. Passengers pulled out their phones again. The scene was unfolding perfectly for Lindsay. Danielle stood calm as ever. She knew that resisting would give Lindsay exactly what she wanted. Instead, she simply said, "That is not mine," her voice, even her tone, cool. The air marshal stepped in and, following protocol, escorted Danielle to the back of the plane. As she passed Lindsay, Danielle leaned in once more and whispered, "You've just made the worst mistake of your life." But this time, Lindsay didn't smile. There was something about the way Danielle said it that made her pause, something firm, unshaken. As the plane continued westward and the passengers whispered excitedly over the supposed drug bust in first class, Lindsay believed she had won. What she didn't realize was that she hadn't ended a threat, she had activated a storm. The hum of first class settled into its usual mid-flight rhythm, soft murmurs rustling newspapers, gentle clinks of silverware. Then came Lindsay Monroe's voice, piercing the air like a siren. "Excuse me." Everyone, she called out. Standing near seat 3A and raising her hand, in it she held a small vacuum-sealed packet, the same one she had secretly planted just minutes earlier. "This was just found in a passenger's bag. It appears to be illegal narcotics." A hush fell over the cabin, followed by gasps and the unmistakable flick of smartphone cameras being raised. All eyes turned to Danielle Reed, who sat silently, her tablet still open in her lap. For a moment no one moved, then Lindsay spoke again, louder this time, playing the part of the dutiful guardian of safety. "This passenger has been acting strangely, and this confirms my suspicion. We need to act immediately." Danielle looked up slowly. Her face was composed, unreadable, almost detached. There was no flash of panic, no stammered denials, just a steady breath drawn through her nose before she spoke. "That is not mine," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the stunned silence of the cabin. "I have no idea how that package ended up in my bag." Lindsay took a half step back, almost as if surprised by Danielle's calm. It was the wrong response. The accused was supposed to flail, to shout, to plead. But Danielle gave her none of that. "Ma'am, you were the only one seated here." Lindsay shot back. "The package was in your handbag." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Danielle didn't flinch. She just folded her tablet, neatly placed it in her lap, and looked Lindsay directly in the eye. The plainclothes air marshal approached, flanked by a second flight attendant. "Reed," he said, his voice professional but firm, "we need you to come with us to the back of the plane. You're not under arrest, but this is a security matter." Danielle nodded once, still not blinking. Around her, passengers whispered, some leaning into the aisles to get a better look, others already uploading video clips to social media. A woman across the aisle muttered, just loud enough to be heard, "Unbelievable, and in first class too." A man beside her chimed in, "This is why I never trust who I sit next to." The sting of those comments didn't show on Danielle's face. Her body language was that of a woman still in control. She gathered her things, stood, and began walking slowly toward the back of the aircraft, escorted by the marshal. As she passed Lindsay, she paused just long enough for a whisper. The tone was barely audible, but carried the weight of thunder. "You have no idea what you've just done," Danielle said, her voice low, her expression unreadable. For a brief moment, Lindsay's facade cracked. A flicker of confusion, maybe even fear, passed through her eyes, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by smugness. She stood straighter, watching Danielle walk away, as if she had won something, but her victory was short-lived. As the whispers around the cabin swelled and passengers checked their phones for updates, the reality was far more complicated than anyone aboard that plane could imagine. Lindsay hadn't just accused a woman, she had ignited the final phase of a federal operation. In the back of the plane, Danielle took her seat with grace, not a trace of the humiliation others assumed she must be feeling. The air marshal sat beside her, flipping through paperwork, unaware that the woman he believed he was detaining was far above his clearance level. Danielle said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was strategic. Her mind was already cataloguing every step of the incident, each camera that had recorded it, each witness who had seen Lindsay at her seat. She knew the CIA's systems were already processing the footage from her type-in camera, which had captured the entire frame job from multiple angles. She didn't need to protest. She didn't need to explain. The truth had already been documented in full. Back in the front of the cabin, Lindsay continued her routine, smiling to passengers who nodded their approval and congratulated her on her quick thinking. She thanked them politely, riding the adrenaline of self-righteousness. She even messaged her supplier. Mid-flight package dropped. Passenger removed, all clean. But even then, she couldn't shake the weight of Danielle's final words. They echoed in her mind like a siren in the distance, growing louder with each mile they flew. "You have no idea what you've just done." She told herself it meant nothing, just another empty threat from someone caught red-handed. But Lindsay didn't realize that the woman she had tried to frame was not just innocent, she was one of the most powerful operatives the US government had ever deployed, and the storm she had unleashed was about to land harder than any turbulence she'd ever faced in the sky. The walk through the terminal felt like a procession of shame. Danielle Reed, flanked by two uniformed airport security officers, moved with steady, deliberate steps, while a swarm of cell phones followed her every motion. Passengers from the flight had spilled into the terminal, trailing behind her, with their devices raised like digital torches. Someone whispered, "That's her," while another muttered, "Caught with drugs right in first class." The security officers didn't say a word. They didn't need to. Their grip on Danielle's arm spoke volumes. To every onlooker, she was guilty. The rumors spread like wildfire, half-truths and whole lies leaping from screen to screen as strangers updated their followers in real time. No one questioned the narrative. No one asked for her side. They didn't see a professional woman or a government agent. They saw a suspect, a problem, a headline. Danielle said nothing. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. Her expression remained unreadable, her stride unbroken. What looked like compliance was in fact calculation. Every second was being recorded, every facial expression memorized. She was studying the officers, the crowd, the environment. But there was also pain in the silence, not from fear. Danielle had faced danger in far more hostile places than this, but from recognition. This wasn't new. This was what it meant too often to move through the world in her skin. Assumed guilty before a word was spoken. Cameras raised before anyone asked who she was. Even now, as one of the highest-ranking covert operatives in the country, Danielle Reed was being reduced to a stereotype. A black woman dragged through an airport under suspicion while the world watched entertained. Inside the small security office, the mood shifted, but only slightly. The officers remained curt and procedural, instructing her to sit, empty her pockets, and prepare for a full bag search. One of them began filling out a report. "You understand," he said in a tone of rehearsed neutrality, "that possession of a controlled substance, especially while in air transit, is a federal offense. You'll need to remain here until law enforcement arrives." Danielle reached slowly into her inner blazer pocket, not for her phone, not for an ID, but for something far more powerful. She placed a black card on the desk. It had no name, no agency, no logo, just a silver seal stamped in the center and a 10-digit code embossed beneath it. "You need to call this number," she said. "Now tell them you have Danielle Reed in custody." The room fell silent. The lead officer hesitated clearly, uncertain. He picked up the card and studied it, then looked at Danielle and then back at the card again. Something about her tone, controlled, authoritative, unapologetic, didn't match the narrative he thought he was enforcing. He stepped out to make the call, shutting the door behind him. The second officer remained still, pretending to be in control, but his nervous tapping on the desk betrayed him. Danielle sat perfectly still, her posture unchanged. She wasn't trying to appear innocent. She was waiting for reality to catch up with them. It didn't take long. Within minutes, the lead officer returned, his face drained of color. He opened the door with a different kind of silence, one heavy with regret and the unmistakable weight of having made a serious mistake. "Ma'am," he began, his voice cracking just slightly. We apologize. We had no idea who you were. We've been advised to provide full cooperation and immediate access to a secure line." His partner stood suddenly unsure of where to put his hands, how to look at the woman they had just marched through, a crowd like a criminal. Danielle didn't respond immediately. She simply retrieved the card, tucked it back into her jacket, and stood. "I'll need access to surveillance footage from gate B22 to the onboard cabin. Within the last 4 hours," she said calmly, "and I need a direct connection to Langley." The officers nodded, scrambling to comply. Their confusion had given way to fear. Danielle didn't gloat. She didn't scold. She moved with the composed precision of someone who had handled far greater crises, but she would never forget how quickly she had been dismissed, how fragile dignity could be in the hands of strangers. As she entered the control center, connected to the security wing, a private line already patched through to CIA headquarters, Danielle glanced at one of the monitors showing a news feed. There, on a trending video, already viewed hundreds of thousands of times, was the footage of her being escorted through the airport. The title read, "Flight Attendant, Hero, Catches Drug Smuggler in First Class." The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. The woman they thought they had humiliated was in fact the one holding all the cards, literally and figuratively. And now, as she began the next phase of her operation with the full authority of her agency behind her, Danielle Reed wasn't just correcting a mistake, she was rewriting the story and exposing the system that allowed it to unfold in the first place. Back at Langley, the halls of the Central Intelligence Agency buzzed not with noise but with urgency. Every footstep carried purpose. Every exchange behind closed doors held weight word of the incident aboard Skyline Airways. Flight 237 had reached the top within hours, not because of social media, but because Danielle Reed had made her call. The agency moved quickly. By the time she arrived at headquarters, her footage had already been decrypted, analyzed and flagged as critical intelligence. In the secure debriefing room deep within the facility, Director James Rutledge waited, flanked by 2 senior analysts. The room was Spartan, no windows, no distractions, just truth, evidence, and accountability. Danielle entered without a word, removed the tiny pin from her lapel, and placed it on the table. What had appeared to be an ordinary accessory was in reality one of the most advanced micro-capture surveillance tools in the field. Danielle connected the pin to the encrypted input device. A moment later, the main screen lit up with high-definition footage. Lindsay Monroe in her flight uniform, reaching into her apron, removing a sealed packet and discreetly tucking it into Danielle's unattended handbag. The angle was perfect. No ambiguity, no questions. The timestamp synced with the aircraft's cabin clock matched the moment Lindsay had later discovered the drugs in front of the passengers. A hush settled over the room. No one spoke for a full minute. Then Danielle fast-forwarded. The next sequence showed Lindsay in the galley, subtly retrieving another package from her locker and slipping it into a coffee cup. She handed the cup to fellow flight attendant Ethan Brooks, who received it with what appeared to be casual conversation, but the angle caught everything. The transfer was clear. The coordination undeniable. What Danielle had captured wasn't just a frame job. It was a drug operation happening in real time. This was the secondary drop. Danielle explained, her voice calm, deliberate. My analysis suggests Lindsay was carrying one package for the official handoff and another as a bonus for herself, likely to be sold independently later. She brought up the audio transcript. The mic embedded in the pin had caught every whisper between Lindsay and Ethan throughout the flight. One particularly damning exchange replayed aloud, Lindsay's voice saying, "Just act normal. She'll be gone before landing." Ethan's reply, "You're sure she's not onto us?" The clarity of the evidence left no room for doubt. It was not only a breach of airline policy, it was a felony. Several, in fact. And this wasn't a one-time incident. It was systemic. Director Rutledge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but his voice carried the weight of the agency's authority. How many others, he asked. Danielle didn't hesitate. I've cross-referenced Lindsay's flight logs with anonymous tips we've received over the past year. She's flown 12 high-risk routes where similar incidents were reported. Every time the accused was a person of color, no charges were ever filed, but the pattern is there: removal, humiliation, and disruption, and the packages always unaccounted for once security gets involved. Rutledge nodded slowly, absorbing the gravity, and Ethan. Same pattern, Danielle replied. 5 overlapping routes. Always the same profile, always the same result. The second analyst tapped a few keys, bringing up background files on Ethan Brooks and Lindsay Monroe, financial inconsistencies, abrupt schedule changes, and multiple flagged but unresolved customer complaints. The director stood, walked to the screen, and studied the footage once more. "We're not just looking at a corrupt crew," he said. "We're looking at a distribution network embedded in commercial aviation." He turned back to Danielle. "What's your assessment of scale?" Danielle's gaze sharpened. "If it's happening on Skyline, it's happening elsewhere. The model is too clean, too efficient. We need to widen the net. Start with regional carriers, then expand to international partners." The racial profiling element adds a layer of misdirection. It's brilliant in the worst way. It makes legitimate complaints less likely to be taken seriously. It weaponizes bias to camouflage criminal enterprise. That sentence hung in the air like a verdict. Rutledge didn't ask for further clarification. He didn't need to prepare a task force. He said, "Finally, I want every flight attendant flagged in these routes, reviewed, pull security footage, passenger complaints, TSA logs, everything, and bring in the Department of Transportation. We're not going to bury this under bureaucracy." Danielle nodded, and Lindsay. The director's eyes narrowed. "Let her enjoy her 15 minutes. She'll be facing federal charges by morning." He looked back at the footage one last time, watching Lindsay's proud expression as she held up the planted drugs like a trophy. She thought she was framing a passenger. He said she didn't know she was framing the one person trained to bring her down. Then he turned to Danielle. "You've done excellent work, Agent Reed. But now it gets bigger. This is no longer just about a flight. This is about trust in an entire system." Lindsay Monroe sat in her apartment that evening, still wearing her uniform, basking in the glow of validation she'd been chasing for years. Her phone buzzed non-stop, likes, shares, tags, and messages pouring in at a pace she'd never experienced. She had taken the footage from Flight 237, carefully edited to omit the moments leading up to her discovery, and uploaded it to her personal account with the title "Flight Attendant Catches Drug Smuggler in First Class. Watch what happens next." Within hours, the clip had exploded across platforms. Comments flooded in, "She's a hero. Finally, someone doing their job. This is why we need more vigilant flight crews." Lindsay couldn't stop scrolling. Every thumbs up, every heart, every fire emoji felt like a reward. She had taken control of the narrative, and now the world believed her. By morning, the video had crossed the 1 million view mark. National news outlets began contacting her through the airline's media office. "Can we get a quote? Would she be available for a live interview?" The public relations team at Skyline Airways jumped into action. For the first time in years, they had a viral moment they could control, and they planned to make the most of it. The CEO's assistant reached out to her personally, inviting her to a special event celebrating excellence in aviation safety. Emails circulated internally about a crew-wide gathering the following afternoon. Her supervisor dropped a not-so-subtle hint that upper management was very impressed with her initiative. The phrases leadership potential and fast-track consideration were used more than once. Lindsay smiled to herself. Finally, she thought. Finally, they see me. In the crew lounge later that day, Lindsay was treated like royalty. Her fellow flight attendants applauded her as she walked in. Some clapped her on the back, others whispered congratulations. Someone even asked for a selfie. Her story had become legend in less than 24 hours, and Lindsay, who had spent years watching younger, more diverse hires pass her by on the promotion ladder, now felt the shift. This was her moment. This was her reward. She wore the praise like a new skin, confident, radiant, righteous. Not once did she consider the possibility that anything might be amiss. Not once did she question how easily the attention came or how dangerous her falsehood really was. She had even rehearsed lines in the mirror. "I was just doing my job. Passenger safety is always my first priority." Her voice held a practiced humility, but her eyes sparkled with pride. She didn't speak about the satisfaction she'd felt watching Danielle be led off that plane. She didn't tell anyone how empowering it had felt to take control, to be the one pointing fingers instead of dodging judgment. In her mind, she'd not only eliminated a problem, she'd redefined her value to the company. She texted her supplier briefly, "All quiet. Heat's on her. Everyone thinks I'm a hero." The reply came a few minutes later. "Don't get cocky. Attention cuts both ways." Lindsay didn't reply. She assumed it was paranoia. She couldn't have known what was coming. She had no idea that at that very moment, Agent Danielle Reed was at CIA headquarters submitting irrefutable surveillance footage showing Lindsay planting the drugs herself. She had no way of knowing that the man she'd handed a package to Ethan Brooks was already under review or that his financials were being traced by federal analysts. She had no idea the video she had just gone viral for was being reanalyzed, frame by frame, by law enforcement. To Lindsay, this was a chapter, closing, not one beginning. She thought she had written the ending. She didn't realize she was only halfway through the story and that she wasn't the hero. She was the case study. By the time she arrived at the terminal for her next shift, her smile was automatic, her posture proud. She wore her uniform like armor and carried her phone like a trophy, ready for more press, more praise. But behind the scenes, the agency had already set the next stage. Her name was being cross-referenced with law enforcement databases. Her social media accounts were archived as digital evidence. Internal security footage had been flagged, copied and logged for federal proceedings, and the very recognition event being planned in her honor. That wasn't a celebration. It was a trap. And Lindsay Monroe, still basking in her manufactured glory, was walking straight into it, smiling. The Skyline Airways conference hall buzzed with energy. Flight crews from across the region had been called in under the pretense of a recognition ceremony, an internal celebration of excellence and professionalism. The room was decorated modestly with the company's signature blue and silver banners, and trays of pastries and coffee lined the back wall. Everyone assumed it was for the viral incident. Whispers floated across rows of crisp uniforms. "She's definitely getting a promotion." Finally, a flight attendant getting some credit. Lindsay Monroe sat in the front row, polished and poised, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Beside her was Ethan Brooks, shifting in his seat, clearly less at ease. Lindsay, however, was glowing. This was the culmination of everything she thought she deserved. All the overtime, the overlooked applications, the years of subtle resentment. Today was the day it would all be redeemed at exactly 2:30 p.m. The side door opened and in walked CEO Matthew Gordon, followed by several members of the executive leadership team. His face, normally friendly and media-trained, was more serious than usual. He approached the podium and adjusted the microphone. "Thank you all for joining us on such short notice," he began. "This meeting is about more than recognition. It's about integrity, it's about security, and it's about trust." Lindsay sat up straighter, her smile tightening. Something about his tone didn't feel celebratory. The room grew quieter. "As many of you know, an incident on Flight 237 has gained national attention," Gordon continued. "But what you don't know is that the incident has prompted a much deeper investigation, one that affects not only this airline, but the entire aviation industry." Gordon turned slightly and gestured to the door. "Today, I want to introduce someone who will be leading a joint task force between Skyline Airways and federal authorities. This person will oversee internal investigations related to crew conduct, passenger safety, and federal compliance." The door opened again, and Danielle Reed stepped into the room. Lindsay's world tilted. Her breath caught in her throat. For a split second, she believed it was a hallucination, until Danielle walked confidently to the front, wearing a dark, tailored suit with a CIA badge displayed prominently on a lanyard. Lindsay's skin went cold. Danielle didn't look at her. Not yet. She stood beside Gordon and took the mic with quiet authority. "Good afternoon," she said. "My name is Special Agent Danielle Reed, and I've been operating under deep cover with the Central Intelligence Agency for the past year. Yesterday's incident was not what it appeared to be." As Danielle spoke, a large screen behind her flickered to life. The footage began to play, the hidden camera view from Danielle's tie-pin, showing Lindsay planting the drugs with methodical precision. The room gasped. Shock rippled through the crowd like a thunderclap. No one moved, no one breathed. The video continued, Lindsay whispering to Ethan in the galley, passing a package inside a coffee cup. Their glances, their movements, their coordination, it was all on display. Danielle's voice remained steady. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate attempt to frame an innocent passenger, and that passenger was me. The silence broke into murmurs. People turned to stare at Lindsay and Ethan. Lindsay's hands trembled. Ethan looked ready to bolt. Security agents, real ones, not company staff, entered the room from both sides. One approached Lindsay. Another moved toward Ethan. "Lindsay Monroe, Ethan Brooks. You are being taken into federal custody on charges of drug trafficking, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations," one agent announced. Ethan stood up abruptly. "She made me do it," he shouted, pointing at Lindsay. "She said no one would believe her. She said, 'Shut up!'" Lindsay hissed through clenched teeth. Her composure was gone. The hero mask had shattered. She looked at Danielle not with defiance, but desperation. "You don't have to do this," she muttered. Danielle didn't reply. Her eyes were calm, resolute. She had warned her twice, but Lindsay had chosen her path. As the agents led them from the room, Ethan panicking. Lindsay stiff with shame, the entire auditorium sat stunned. Crew members who had applauded Lindsay just hours earlier now looked away, embarrassed by their misplaced admiration. Danielle turned back to the microphone. "This is not about one flight. It's about a pattern, one that has gone unchecked for too long. My mission was to expose the individuals abusing their positions, but also to confront the systems that enabled it. We are not here to shame, we are here to change." She looked out at the silent crowd, not with anger, but with challenge. And that change starts now, in the days following the dramatic takedown of Lindsay Monroe and Ethan Brooks. Skyline Airways found itself at the center of a storm it could no longer ignore. What began as a public relations victory, the viral rise of a so-called hero, had turned into a full-blown reckoning. The video footage revealed by Agent Danielle Reed was broadcast on national news, dissected by investigative journalists, and shared across every major social media platform. CEO Matthew Gordon faced reporters not with spin, but with solemn accountability. "We failed," he said in a live press conference. "We failed to protect our passengers. We failed to uphold our values. And we failed to detect patterns of racial bias that allowed this criminal operation to exist within our ranks." There was no deflection, no denial. For once, an airline didn't try to cover its tracks, it chose to pave new ones. Within 48 hours, Skyline Airways announced a sweeping reform initiative, first on the list, mandatory bias, training for all employees from ground staff to senior executives. But this wasn't the typical check-the-box training. Danielle worked directly with the airline's leadership to co-develop a comprehensive program grounded in real case studies, starting with her own. The training included immersive simulations, historical context, and personal testimonies from passengers and crew who had faced discrimination silently for years. A new passenger advocacy office was launched to provide a direct, independent channel for travelers to report misconduct. This isn't just a policy shift. Gordon declared, it's a cultural reset. For once, corporate reform didn't feel like lip service. It felt like justice taking root, but the impact didn't stop with Skyline. As Danielle had predicted, the investigation's scope expanded rapidly. The Department of Transportation, in collaboration with the CIA and FAA, began auditing other domestic airlines. What they uncovered sent shockwaves through the industry. At least 3 other major carriers had flight attendants or ground crew involved in similar drug operations, often hiding behind racially charged false accusations to deflect suspicion. A disturbing pattern emerged. Black and brown passengers being disproportionately profiled, removed or detained, all while criminal exchanges happened in plain sight. The reckoning spread like wildfire. Airlines once considered untouchable were forced to answer for years of unchecked power and invisible prejudice. Danielle became a central figure in the national response, not just as the agent who exposed the system, but as a voice shaping what would replace it. She was appointed to a joint federal advisory committee, tasked with designing new national protocols for airline crew, accountability, racial equity, and internal investigations. These protocols would go on to influence FAA policy, TSA behavior review processes, and even airline union contracts. She traveled to conferences, testified before congressional panels, and led workshops for aviation leaders who now looked to her not just for insight, but for integrity. For the first time in decades, the phrase passenger safety began to mean more than turbulence and seatbelts. It meant dignity, fairness, protection from abuse, not just from threats outside the cabin, but from those within it. Inside the industry, many executives struggled to adapt. Change at this scale wasn't comfortable. There were resignations, public apologies, lawsuits, but there were also breakthroughs. Employees who had long kept silent about internal racism and mistreatment began to speak up. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. Anonymous reporting tools were rolled out company-wide. And at the heart of it all, Danielle remained focused, not on punishment, but on prevention. This isn't about tearing down the industry, she said during a televised panel discussion. It's about making sure the people who power it are held to the standards we claim to believe in. We're not asking for perfection. We're asking for truth and accountability. The ripple effects reached far beyond airports. News outlets covered the transformation as a turning point, not just in aviation, but in workplace ethics nationwide. HR departments in unrelated industries began reviewing their own systems for bias. Civil rights organizations praised the reforms as a modern model for corporate responsibility. Danielle continued her work quietly, never seeking the spotlight. But her name had become synonymous with resilience and reform, and as airlines adapted to the new standards she helped design, passengers began to notice the difference. Not immediately, and not everywhere, but enough to know that change was no longer a press release. It was policy. It was practice. It was real. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the sentence. Lindsay Monroe stood pale and still at the defendant's table, her once impeccable posture wilted under the weight of consequences she had never imagined. 18 years in federal prison, the judge declared. For drug trafficking evidence, tampering, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. There were no camera crews inside, no applause, no sympathy, only the final echo of a verdict that carried the full force of the truth she had tried so desperately to rewrite. Her attorney placed a hand on her shoulder, but Lindsay didn't react. Her eyes were fixed ahead, hollow, haunted not just by what she had done, but by who she had become in the process. A viral moment, once her greatest victory had become the first entry in a file that would follow her for the rest of her life. Ethan Brooks sat beside her, a smaller sentence on paper, but just as heavy in reality. After cooperating with federal investigators and testifying against Lindsay, he received a reduced term of 5 years. His confession had accelerated the investigation and revealed additional routes used in the trafficking ring, but it did little to spare him the stain of betrayal. He left the courtroom in silence, escorted by agents who no longer looked at him as a peer. Lindsay, meanwhile, would be transferred to a federal correctional facility, hours away, far from the terminal where she once believed she'd earned her crown. The woman who had framed an innocent person to save herself was now a cautionary tale, etched into legal precedent and aviation policy alike. While the justice system moved forward, so did Danielle Reed. She declined all interviews after the sentencing. She had no interest in the spotlight. Instead, she returned to what she did best, training others to see what most people miss. The Federal Air Marshal Service invited her to lead a new national training module, one focused not on weapons handling or threat containment, but on perception pattern recognition and, most critically, bias. In a quiet auditorium at a federal training center in Virginia, Danielle stood in front of a new class of air marshals, flight crew supervisors and TSA leads. The screen behind her displayed the familiar footage, the hidden camera view of Lindsay slipping the packet into her handbag. What you're about to watch, Danielle began, is not a story about a bad apple. It's a story about a system that let her bloom. Her message was clear, unwavering. She walked the class through every step, how microaggressions signaled deeper bias, how unchecked prejudice could be exploited to mask criminal activity, and how procedural complacency created space for injustice. Lindsay Monroe didn't act alone, she told them. She was protected by silence, by assumption, by a culture that lets us trust uniforms more than instincts. We can't afford to be that blind anymore. She didn't speak in anger, only conviction. Her presence, calm and grounded, challenged the room, not to memorize rules, but to change how they saw the world. At the end of the training, the class gave her a standing ovation, not because she asked for it, but because she'd earned it. She had turned her pain into a curriculum and her integrity into a roadmap. Outside of the training rooms and secure federal spaces, Danielle's impact continued to ripple outward. University programs in law and criminal justice began citing the case as a textbook example of institutional accountability. Anti-bias coalitions featured her work in national campaigns, and quietly, letters began arriving at her agency desk, some from former crew members, others from passengers who had once stayed silent when they saw unfairness unfold. Because of what you did? One note read, "I spoke up the next time it happened, and someone listened." Danielle kept each letter in a drawer, not for pride, but for purpose. They reminded her that justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it whispered through changed behavior, through stories that never made the news, but shifted lives all the same. And yet, she remained grounded in a simple truth: her work was far from finished. The sentencing of Lindsay Monroe had brought closure to one chapter, but the systems that allowed her to thrive in the first place, those required deeper reform, deeper vigilance. Danielle knew she couldn't dismantle it all overnight. But she also knew this change doesn't begin in press rooms or policy documents. It begins in moments, small deliberate choices to speak, to intervene, to see someone fully, and it begins in people who refuse to stay silent when silence becomes complicity. For Danielle, that belief wasn't theory. It was experience. It was survival. And now, it was leadership. As she left the training center one crisp morning, sunlight pouring across the tarmac outside, Danielle paused by a departing flight. A black flight attendant stood at the gate speaking warmly to a young passenger. The interaction was brief, mundane even, but Danielle smiled, not because everything was fixed, not because the system was flawless, but because something had shifted. Eyes had opened, voices had risen, and the truth had landed. In a world that had once tried to erase her, Agent Danielle Reed had left a mark no one would ever mistake again, not as a warning, but as a legacy. In the weeks and months that followed the sentencing, Danielle Reed's story continued to echo quietly, powerfully, far beyond the courtroom, beyond the headlines, even beyond the walls of Langley. She began receiving letters not from journalists or politicians, but from the people whose lives had been changed in smaller, quieter ways. Flight attendants from Alaska to Florida wrote to her in longhand and email, sometimes anonymously, sometimes signed with trembling sincerity. They told her about the moments they had looked away in the past, when a colleague made a racially charged comment, when a passenger was treated differently without explanation, when silence felt safer than truth. But now they said things had shifted. "I saw myself in you," one letter began, "and next time I'll speak up." Danielle read every letter. She saved every one. These messages weren't fan mail. They were evidence of awakening, of reckoning, of a long overdue cultural correction. Something fundamental had changed in the skies. Across the aviation industry, the tone of conversations began to shift. Bias training was no longer just a compliance box. It became a conversation starter. In staff lounges and safety briefings, flight crews began calling out inappropriate jokes, questioning questionable procedures, and perhaps, most importantly, listening to voices they had once ignored. At first, it was uncomfortable. There was resistance, but real change always starts that way. One airline started holding monthly inclusion briefings. Another piloted a mentorship program, pairing senior crew members with new hires from underrepresented backgrounds. Slowly but surely, a new culture emerged, one where dignity wasn't conditional and respect wasn't optional. It wasn't perfect, and Danielle knew that she'd spent enough time on the front lines of injustice to understand that systems built over decades don't crumble overnight. But for the first time in her career, she saw momentum, and it wasn't just institutional, it was deeply human. She saw it in the Blackgate agent who no longer second-guessed herself when enforcing boarding policy, in the Latina crew leader who now spoke openly about the favoritism she'd once endured in silence, in the white co-pilot who stopped a conversation mid-flight to challenge a colleague's casual comment about certain passengers. These weren't headlines, they were habits. And they were starting to change. Danielle's case became more than a chapter in federal records. It became a training tool, a college curriculum, a moral benchmark. Her story was used in HR onboarding videos and taught in ethics classes. Law schools dissected the investigation as a model for merging covert operations with systemic reform. Airline executives who had once dismissed bias as too abstract to measure now used her findings to build new reporting systems and data transparency protocols. It wasn't just about what she exposed, it was how she had exposed it without grandstanding, without vengeance, without compromising truth. Danielle didn't just dismantle a criminal operation. She rewrote the standards of accountability in mid-air, and yet she never claimed victory. Justice, she once said during a quiet internal agency debrief, isn't a finish line, it's a framework. For her, the work continued, not with badges or arrests, but in conversations in policy drafts. In the next trainee who sat through one of her workshops and walked away, seeing passengers not as profiles, but as people. She declined book deals, ignored talk show invites, and politely turned down award galas. Her greatest reward, she often told close colleagues, was seeing change happen in places where she'd once been invisible. Change that no one could unsee. Change that stuck. Years later, a new class of recruits would step into the same training center where Danielle once taught her first federal air marshal course. On the wall outside the auditorium, etched into a simple plaque beneath a photo of Flight 237's cabin, were words pulled directly from Danielle's final operation report. The words weren't loud or poetic, they were measured, clear and unshakable. Justice is not just about punishing wrongdoing, it's about creating systems where doing right becomes the easiest choice for everyone. It was a legacy, not of fear or fire, but of clarity, conviction, and courage. And though Danielle had long since returned to quiet service, her story still flew in every sky where equity was finally given a seat. Not in the back, but at the front, where it always belonged. If stories like this one moved you, Stories that challenge injustice, reveal hidden truths, and spotlight the strength of those who stand alone for what's right. Then, deep inside, HQ is your home. We dive beyond the headlines, uncover the untold, and bring you narratives that stir conscience and ignite change. Subscribe to Deep Inside HQ for more true-to-life investigations and powerful storytelling that leaves a mark. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that real justice begins where silence ends.